The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a vivid first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's journey from enlistment to the harsh realities of battle and camp life. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. On the afternoon of December 18th, suddenly, without any previous warning or notification, the bugle sounded, "Fall in." And all the regiment fit for duty and not on guard at once formed on the regimental parade ground. From there, we marched to the depot, and, with the 43rd Illinois of our brigade, got on the cars and were soon being whirled over the road in a northerly direction. It was a warm, sunshiny day, and we common soldiers supposed we were going on just some little temporary scout, so we encumbered ourselves with nothing but our arms, haversacks, and canteens. Neglecting to take our blankets was a grievous mistake, as we later found out to our sorrow. We arrived at Jackson a little before sundown, left the cars there, and, with the 43rd, forthwith marched out about 2 miles east of town. A little after dark, we halted in an old field on the left of the road, in front of a little old country graveyard called Salem Cemetery, and there bivouacked for the night. Along in the evening, the weather turned intensely cold. It was a clear, starlit night, and the stars glittered in the heavens like little icicles. We were strictly forbidden to build any fires, for the reason, as our officers truly said, that the Confederates were not more than half a mile away, right in our front. As before stated, we had no blankets, and how we suffered with the cold. I shall never forget that night of December 18, 1862. We would form little columns of 20 or 30 men, in 2 ranks, and would just trot round and round in the tall weeds and broom sedge to keep from chilling to death. Sometimes, we would pile down on the ground in great bunches and curl up close together like hogs in our efforts to keep warm. But some part of our bodies would be exposed, which soon would be stinging with cold, then up we would get and renew the trotting process. At one time in the night, some of the boys, rendered almost desperate by their suffering, started to build a fire with some fence rails. The red flames began to curl around the wood, and I started for the fire, intending to absorb some of that glowing heat, if, as Uncle Remus says, it was the loss acknowledgement. But right then, a mounted officer dashed up to the spot and sprang from his horse. He was wearing big cavalry boots and jumped on that fire with both feet, stamping it out in less time than I am taking to tell about it. I heard afterward that he was Colonel Engelman, of the 43rd Illinois, then the commander of our brigade. Having put out the fire, he turned on the men standing around and swore at them furiously. He said that the rebels were right out in our front and that in less than 5 minutes after we had betrayed our presence by fires, they would open on us with artillery and shell hell out of us and more to the same effect. The boys listened in silence, meek as lambs, and no more fires were started by us that night. But the hours seemed interminably long, and it looked like the night would never come to an end. At last, some little woods birds were heard, faintly chirping in the weeds and underbrush nearby. Then some owls set up a hooting in the woods behind us, and I knew that dawn was approaching. When it became light enough to distinguish one another, we saw that we presented a doleful appearance, all hollow-eyed, with blue noses, pinched faces, and shivering as if we would shake to pieces. Permission was then given to build small fires to cook our breakfast, and we did not wait for the order to be repeated. I made a quart-canful of strong, hot coffee, toasted some bacon on a stick, and then, with some hardtack, had a good breakfast and felt better. Breakfast over, which did not take long, the regiment was drawn back into the cemetery and placed in line behind the section of the enclosing fence that faced to the front. The fence was of post and plank, the planks arranged lengthwise, with spaces between. We were ordered to lie flat on the ground and keep the barrels of our guns out of sight as much as possible. Our position, in general, may be described as follows. The right of the regiment rested near the dirt road, and at right angles to it. The ground before us was open for more than half a mile. It sloped down gently, then it rose gradually to a long, bare ridge, or slight elevation of ground, which extended parallel to our front. The road was enclosed by an old-time staked and ridered fence, of the worm pattern. On our right, and on the other side of the road, was a thick forest of tall trees, in which the 43rd Illinois was posted. The cemetery was thickly studded with tall, native trees, and a few ornamental ones, such as cedar and pine. Soon after we had been put in position, as above stated, Colonel Engelman, the brigade commander, came galloping up and stopped about opposite the front of the regiment. Major Orr, our regimental commander, who was in the rear of the regiment on foot, walked out to meet him. Engelmann was a German and a splendid officer. "Good morning, Major," he said in a loud voice we all heard. "How are deploys?" "All right," answered the Major. "We had rather a chilly night, but are feeling first-rate now." "Dat is gut," responded the Colonel, and continued in his loud tone, "Our friends are right out here in de bush, I reckon dey'll show up presently. Maybe so dey will give us a touch of dear artillery practice, but dat hurts nobody. Shust have deploys keep cool." Then he approached the Major closer, said something in a low tone we did not hear, waved his hand to us, and then galloped off to the right. He was hardly out of sight when, sure enough, 2 or 3 cannon shots were heard out in front, followed by a scattering fire of small arms. We had a small force of our cavalry in the woods beyond the ridge I have mentioned, and they soon appeared, slowly falling back. They were spread out in a wide, extended skirmish line and acted fine. They would trot a little ways to the rear, then face about and fire their carbines at the advancing foe, who, as yet, was unseen by us. Finally, they galloped off to the left and disappeared in the woods, and all was still for a short time. Suddenly, without a note of warning, and not preceded by even a skirmish line, there appeared, coming over the ridge in front and down the road, a long column of Confederate cavalry. They were, when first seen, at a walk and marching by the flank, with a front of 4 men. How deep the column was, we could not tell. The word was immediately passed down our line not to fire until at the word of command, and that we were to fire by file, beginning on the right. That is, only 2 men, front and rear rank, would fire together, and so on, down the line. The object of this was apparent. By the time the left of the regiment had emptied their guns, the right would have reloaded, and thus a continuous firing would be maintained. With guns cocked and fingers on the triggers, we waited in tense anxiety for the word to fire. Major Orr was standing a few paces in the rear of the center of the regiment, watching the advance of the enemy. Finally, when they were in fair musket range, came the order, cool and deliberate, without a trace of excitement. "Attention, bataillon! Fire by file! Ready! Commence firing!" And down the line crackled the musketry. Concurrently with us, the old 43rd Illinois on the right joined in the serenade. In the front file of the Confederate column was one of the usual fellows with more daring than discretion, who was mounted on a tall, white horse. Of course, as long as that horse was on its feet, everybody shot at him or the rider. But that luckless steed soon went down in a cloud of dust, and that was the end of old Whitey. The effect of our fire on the enemy was marked and instantaneous. The head of their column crumpled up instanter, the road was full of dead and wounded horses, while several that were riderless went galloping down the road by us, with bridle reins and stirrups flapping on their necks and flanks. I think there is no doubt that the Confederates were taken completely by surprise. They stopped short when we opened on them, wheeled around, and went back much faster than they came, except for a little bunch who had been dismounted. They hoisted a white rag, came in, and surrendered. The whole affair was exceedingly short and sweet. In duration, it could not have exceeded more than a few minutes, but it was highly interesting as long as it lasted. But now the turn of the other fellows was to come. Soon after their charging column disappeared behind the ridge in our front, they put in position on the crest of the ridge 2 black, snaky-looking pieces of artillery and began giving us the benefit of the artillery practice Colonel Engelmann had alluded to. They were beyond the range of our muskets, we had no artillery with our little force and just had to lie there and take it. I know nothing about the technicalities of cannon firing, so I can only describe in my own language how it appeared to us. The enemy now knew just where we were, there were no obstructions between them and us, and they concentrated their fire on our regiment. Sometimes they threw a solid shot at us, but mostly, they fired shells. They were in plain sight, and we could see every movement connected with the firing of the guns. After a piece was fired, the first thing done was to swab it. 2 men would rush to the muzzle with the swabber, give it a few quick turns in the bore, then throw down the swabber and grab up the rammer. Another man would then run forward with the projectile and insert it in the muzzle of the piece, the rammers would ram it home, and then stand clear. The man at the breech would then pull the lanyard, and now look out. A tongue of red flame would leap from the mouth of the cannon, followed by a billow of white smoke. Then would come the scream of the missile as it passed over our heads, if a solid shot, or exploded near our front or rear, if a shell, and lastly, we would hear the report of the gun. Then we all drew a long breath. When they threw shells at us, their method was to elevate the muzzle of the gun and discharge the missile in such a manner that it would describe what I suppose would be called the parabola of a curve. As it would be nearing the zenith of its flight, we could follow it distinctly with the naked eye. It looked like a big, black bug. You may rest assured that we watched the downward course of this messenger of mischief with the keenest interest. Sometimes, it looked as if it would hit our line, sure, but it never did. And, as stated, we could only lie there and watch all this, without the power on our part to do a thing and return. Such a situation is trying on the nerves. But firing at our line was much like shooting at the edge of a knife blade, and their practice on us, which lasted at least 2 hours, for all practical results, to quote Colonel Engelman, "shoost hurt nobody." A private of Company G had his head carried away by a fragment of a shell, and a few others were slightly injured, and that was the extent of our casualties. After enduring this cannonading for the time above stated, Colonel Engelman became apprehensive that the Confederate cavalry were flanking us and trying to get between us and Jackson, so he ordered our force to retire. We fell back in good order for about a mile, then halted and faced to the front again. Reinforcements soon came out from Jackson, and then the whole command advanced, but the enemy had disappeared. Our regiment marched in column by the flank up the road down which the Confederates had made their charge. They had removed their killed and wounded, but at the point reached by their head of column, the road was full of dead horses. Old Whitey was sprawled out in the middle of the lane, with his nostrils all wide, and more than a dozen bullet holes in his body. Near his carcass, I saw a bloody yarn sock, with a bullet hole square through the instep. I made up my mind then and there that if ever I happened to get into the cavalry, I would, if possible, avoid riding a white horse. I will now say something about poor Sam Cobb, heretofore mentioned, and then he will disappear from this history. Sam was with us at the beginning of this affair on December 19th, but at the very instant that the enemy came in sight, he broke from the ranks and ran, and never showed up until we returned to Jackson some days later. He then had one of his hands tied up and claimed that he had been wounded in the fight. The nature of his wound was simply a neat little puncture, evidently made by a pointed instrument, in the ball of the forefinger of one of his hands. Not a shot had been fired at us up to the time when he fled, so it was impossible for his hurt to have been inflicted by the enemy. It was the belief of all of us that he had put his forefinger against a tree and then jabbed the point of his bayonet through the ball thereof. I heard Captain Reddish, in bitter language, charge him with this afterward, and poor Sam just hung his head and said nothing. When the regiment veteranized in 1864, Sam did not re-enlist and was mustered out in February 1865, at the end of his term of service. He later emigrated to a southwestern state and died there several years ago. In my opinion, he really was to be sincerely pitied, for I think, as he had told me at Bolivar, he just couldn't help it. We advanced this day, December 19th, only 2 or 3 miles beyond Salem Cemetery and bivouacked for the night in an old field. The weather had changed and was now quite pleasant. Besides, the embargo on fires was lifted, so the discomfort of the previous night was only something to be laughed about. The next day, we were afoot early and marched east in the direction of Lexington, about 15 miles. But we encountered no enemy, and on December 21st, we turned square around and marched back to Jackson. General Forrest was in command of the Confederate cavalry operating in this region, and he completely fooled General J.C. Sullivan, the Union commander of the District of Jackson. While we were on this wild goose chase towards Lexington, Forrest simply whirled around our flanks at Jackson and swept north on the railroad, scooping in almost everything to the Kentucky line and burning bridges and destroying culverts on the railroad in great shape. During our short stay that ensued at Jackson, an event occurred that I have always remembered with pleasure. In 1916, I wrote a brief preliminary statement touching this Salem Cemetery affair, followed by one of my Army letters. The two made a connected article, which was published in the Erie, Kansas, Record. It may result in some repetition, but I have concluded to reproduce this published article here, which I have titled, A Soldier's Christmas Dinner, by Judge Leander Stillwell. Christmas Day in the year 1862 was a gloomy one, in every respect, for the soldiers of the Union Army in West Tennessee. 5 days before, the Confederate General Van Dorn had captured Grant's depot of supplies at Holly Springs, and government stores, valued at $1.5 million, had gone up in smoke and flame. About the same time, Forrest had struck the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, on which we depended to bring us supplies of hardtack and bacon from the north, and had made a wreck of the road from about Jackson, Tennessee, nearly to Columbus, Kentucky. For some months prior to these disasters, the regiment to which I belonged, the 61st Illinois Infantry, had been stationed at Bolivar, Tennessee, engaged in guarding the railroad from that place to Toone's Station, a few miles north of Bolivar. On December 18th, with another regiment of our brigade, we were sent by rail to Jackson to assist in repelling Forrest, who was threatening that place. On the following day, the two regiments, numbering in the aggregate about 500 men, in connection with a small detachment of our cavalry, had a lively and spirited little brush with the Confederate forces about 2 miles east of Jackson, near a country burying ground called Salem Cemetery, which resulted in our having the good fortune to give them a salutary check. Reinforcements were sent out from Jackson, and Forrest disappeared. The next day, our entire command marched about 15 miles eastward in the direction of the Tennessee River. It was doubtless supposed by our commanding general that the Confederates had retreated in that direction, but he was mistaken. Forrest had simply whipped around Jackson, struck the railroad a few miles north of it, and then had continued north up the road, capturing and destroying as he went. On the succeeding day, December 21st, we all marched back to Jackson, and my regiment went into camp on a bleak, muddy hillside in the suburbs of the town. There we remained until December 29th, when we were sent to Carroll Station, about 8 miles north of Jackson. I well remember how gloomy I felt on the morning of that Christmas Day at Jackson, Tennessee. I was then only a little over 19 years of age. I had been in the Army nearly a year, lacking just a few days, and every day of that time, except for a furlough of 2 days granted at our camp of instruction before we left Illinois for the front, had been passed with the regiment in camp and field. That Christmas morning, my thoughts naturally turned to the little old log cabin in the backwoods of western Illinois, and I couldn't help thinking about the nice Christmas dinner that I knew the folks at home would sit down to on that day. There would be a great chicken pot pie, with its savory crust and a superabundance of light, puffy dumplings, delicious, light, hot biscuits, a big ball of our own homemade butter, yellow as gold, broad slices of juicy ham, the product of hogs of our own fattening and home-cured with hickory wood smoke, fresh eggs from the barn, in reckless profusion, fried in the ham gravy, mealy Irish potatoes, baked in their jackets, coffee with cream about half an inch thick, apple butter and crab-apple preserves, a big plate of wild honey in the comb, and, winding up, a thick wedge of mince pie that Mother knew so well how to make, such mince pie, in fact, as was made only in those days, and is now as extinct as the dodo. And when I turned from these musings upon the bill of fare they would have at home to contemplate the dreary realities of my own possible dinner for the day, my oyster can full of coffee and a quarter ration of hardtack and sowbelly comprised the menu. If the eyes of some old soldier should light upon these lines, and he should thereupon feel disposed to curl his lip with unutterable scorn and say, "This fellow was a milksop and ought to have been fed on Christian commission and sanitary goods, and put to sleep at night with a warm rock at his feet," I can only say in extenuation that the soldier whose feelings I have been trying to describe was only a boy. And, boys, you probably know how it was yourselves during the first year of your Army life. But, after all, the soldier had a Christmas dinner that day, and it is of that I have started out to speak. Several years ago, my old Army letters, which had been so carefully kept and cherished for all these many years, passed from the keeping of those to whom they had been addressed back into the possession of him who penned them. And now, after the lapse of 54 years, one of these old letters, written to my father, shall retell the story of this Christmas dinner. Jackson, Tennessee. December 27, 1862. Mr. J. O. Stillwell. Otter Creek, Illinois. I wrote you a short and hasty letter at the beginning of this week to let you know that I was all right and to give you a brief account of our recent ups and downs, but I doubt if you have received it. The trains have not been running since we came back to Jackson from our march after Forrest. The talk in camp is that the rebels have utterly destroyed the railroad north of here, clear to the Mississippi River, and that they have also broken it in various places and damaged it badly south of here, between Bolivar and Grand Junction. I have no idea when this letter will reach you, but I will write it anyhow and trust to luck and Uncle Sam to get it through in due time. We are now in camp on a muddy hillside in the outskirts of Jackson. I think the spot where we are must have been a cavalry camp last summer. Lots of corn cobs are scattered on the ground, along with old scraps of harness leather and other junk that accumulates where horses are kept standing around. When we left Bolivar, we were in quite a hurry, with no time to primp or comb our hair, and we did not bring our tents along. So now, we are just living out in the open and boarding at sprawls. There is plenty of wood for fires, and we have jayhawked enough planks and boards to lie on to keep us out of the mud. We just curl up at night in our blankets with all our clothes on and manage to get along fairly well. Our worst trouble now is the lack of food. The destruction of the railroad has cut off our supplies, and there is no telling exactly how long it may be before it will be fixed and in running order again. Because of this, I suppose, they have been compelled to cut down our rations. We get half rations of coffee and quarter rations of hardtack and bacon. What we call small rations, such as Yankee beans, rice, and split peas, are played out. At least, we do not get any. The hardtack is now so precious that the orderly sergeant no longer knocks open a box and lets every man help himself. Instead, he stands right over the box and counts the number of tacks he gives to each soldier. I never thought I would see the day when Army hardtack would be in such demand that it would have to be counted out to us as if it were money, but that is exactly what is happening now. And that is not all. The boys will stand around until the box is emptied and then pick up the fragments that have fallen to the ground, scrape off the mud with their knives, and eat the little pieces, glad to get them. Now and then, to help out the sowbelly, we get quarter rations of fresh beef from the carcass of a Tennessee steer that the quartermaster somehow manages to lay hands on. But it is awful beef, lean, slimy, skinny, and stringy. The boys say that if you throw a piece up against a tree, it will just stick there and quiver and twitch, just like one of those blue-bellied lizards at home does when you knock it off a fence rail with a stick. I just wish that old Forrest, who is the cause of almost all this trouble, had to go without anything to eat until he was so weak that he would have to be fed with a spoon. Maybe after he had been really hungry for a while, he would know how it feels himself and would let our railroads alone. But I want to tell you that I had a real bully Christmas dinner, in spite of old Forrest and his whole caboodle. It was just a piece of the greatest good luck I have had in many a day. When Christmas morning came, I was feeling awfully blue. In spite of everything, I could not help but think about the good dinner you folks at home would be having that day, and I pictured it all out in my imagination. Then, almost every one of the boys had something to say about what he would be eating for Christmas dinner if he were home, and they would run through the list of good things until it was almost enough to make one go crazy. To make matters worse, just the day before, in an old camp, I had found some tattered fragments of a New York Illustrated newspaper with a whole lot of pictures about Thanksgiving Day in the Army of the Potomac. The pictures showed soldiers sitting around piles of roast turkeys, pumpkin pies, pound cake, and goodness knows what else. I took it for granted that they would have the same kind of feast today. You see, the men in that army, thanks to their railroads, are only a few hours from home, and Old Forest is not in their neighborhood. So it is easy for them to have good times. And here we were, way down in Tennessee, in the mud and the cold, with no tents, on quarter rations, and picking scraps of hardtack out of the mud and eating them. It was enough to make a preacher swear. But around noon, John Ritchie came to me and proposed that, since it was Christmas Day, we should strike out and forage for a square meal. It did not take much persuasion, and straightaway, we set off. About half a mile from our camp, in the outskirts of town, we came to a large, handsome, 2-story-and-a-half frame house, with a whole lot of slave cabins in the rear. John took a look at the place and said, "Lee, right here's our meat." We went into the yard through a little side gate between the big house and the slave quarters and were heading toward one of the cabins when, out from the back porch of the big house, stepped the lady of the place herself. That spoiled the whole game. John whirled around and started to sidle away. But the lady walked toward us and said, in a very kind and friendly manner, "Do you men want anything?" John, with his head thrown back and nose pointed skyward, replied quickly, "Oh, no, ma'am, not at all, ma'am, 1,000 times obliged, ma'am," and continued his retreat. By this time, I had hold of the cape of his overcoat and was plucking at it in utter desperation. "John," I said, speaking low, "what in thunder do you mean? This is the best chance we'll ever have." The lady must have noticed the hungry, pleading look on my face. She paused for a moment, then said firmly, "You men come right in. We have just finished our dinner, but in a few minutes, the servants can have something prepared for you, and I think you are hungry." That was all I needed to hear. With a grateful nod, I followed her inside. The dining room was warm and inviting, with a crackling fire in the large fireplace. The table was set with the remnants of their meal, and soon, a colored girl came in to prepare fresh food for us. In a few minutes, we were seated before a spread of fried beefsteak, warm light bread, fresh butter, stewed dried apples, cucumber pickles, preserves, rich coffee with sugar and cream, and the finest molasses I had ever tasted. To top it off, there was stewed dried apple pie and some kind of custard that was unlike anything I had ever eaten before. As we ate, the lady sat with us and talked kindly, making us feel welcome, as if we were not just ragged soldiers but honored guests. That Christmas dinner remains one of the best meals of my life, not just because of the food, but because of the kindness behind it. So, despite the hardships of war, I had a Christmas to remember. Well, I will bring my letter to a close. Do not worry if you fail to get a letter from me as regularly as before. Things are still a bit unsettled down here, and we may not be able to count on the usual regularity of the mails for some time to come. So, goodbye for this time. Leander Stillwell. Soon after we returned to Jackson, a detail from each company was sent to Bolivar to bring up our knapsacks and blankets, and we were then much more comfortable. On December 29th, my company and 2 others from our regiment were sent by rail to Carroll Station, about 8 miles north of Jackson. There had been a detachment of about 100 men from the 106th Illinois Infantry previously stationed there, guarding the railroad, but Forrest had captured them around December 20th. So, on our arrival, we found nothing but a crude sort of stockade and the usual rubbish of an old camp. There was no town, just a platform and a switch. Our life there was somewhat uneventful, and I recall now only 2 incidents that may be worth mentioning. I have previously mentioned how, while on picket at night, I learned something about the nocturnal habits of different animals and birds. I had a somewhat comical experience in this regard while on guard one night near Carroll Station, but first, a brief explanation. It was not part of the duty of a non-commissioned officer to stand a regular tour of guard duty with his musket in hand. His role was to exercise general supervisory control over the men at his post and ensure they relieved each other at the proper time. However, it often happened in our regiment that our numbers present for duty were so diminished, and the guard details so heavy, that the sergeants and corporals had to stand as sentries just the same as the privates. This was especially the case at Carroll Station. On the occasion of the incident I am about to mention, the picket post was on the crest of a low ridge, or slight elevation, under some large oak trees, near an old, tumble-down deserted building that had once been a blacksmith shop. There were 3 of us on this post, and one of my turns came at midnight. I was standing by one of the trees, listening, looking, and thinking. The night was calm, with a full moon. The space in front of us, sloping down to a little hollow, was bare, but the ascending ground beyond was covered with a dense growth of young oaks that had not yet shed their leaves. We had orders to be extremely watchful and vigilant, as parties of the enemy were believed to be in our vicinity. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound in front of me, seemingly coming from the far edge of the oak forest. The noise steadily increased in volume, and whatever was making it was coming my way, through the trees and down the slope of the opposite ridge. The sound grew louder and louder, until it resembled the steady tramp of a line of marching men, with a front at least 100 yards wide. I was sure there was trouble ahead and that the Philistines were upon me. However, a sentinel who made a false alarm while on duty was liable to severe punishment, and at the very least, would be laughed at all over the regiment and never hear the end of it. So, I did not wake my comrades but instead got in the shadow of the trunk of a tree, cocked my gun, and awaited developments. And soon, they came. The advancing line emerged from the forest into the moonlight, and it was nothing but a big drove of hogs, out on a midnight foraging expedition for acorns and the like. Well, I let down the hammer of my gun and felt relieved, and mighty glad I had not woken the other boys. But I still insist that this crackling, crashing uproar, made by the advance of the hog battalion through the underbrush and woods, under the circumstances I described, would have deceived the very elect. A few days later, I was again on picket at the old blacksmith shop. Our orders required that at least once during the day, one of the guards should scout out at least half a mile, carefully observing the area for any signs of enemy activity. This was done to determine if Confederate forces were hovering around in our vicinity. On this particular day, after dinner, I set out alone on this little reconnaissance mission. I had gone a little more than half a mile from the post and was walking along a dirt road, with a cornfield on my left and a dense forest on my right. About 100 yards in front, the road turned sharply to the left, with cornfields on both sides. The corn had been gathered, but the stalks were still standing. As I glanced to the left, I noticed a white cloth fluttering above the cornstalks at the end of a pole, slowly moving in my direction. Peering through the tops of the stalks, I saw, coming down the road behind the white flag, about a dozen Confederate cavalrymen. I broke into a run, soon reached the turn in the road, cocked my gun, leveled it at the party, and shouted, "Halt!" They stopped immediately, and the bearer of the flag called out that they were a flag of truce party. I then said, "Advance, one." But instead, they all started forward. I shouted again, "Halt!" and repeated the command, "Advance, one." This time, the leader rode up alone. I kept my gun cocked and at the ready as he approached. He then proceeded to tell me a rambling, disjointed story about how they were a flag of truce party, on business related to the exchange of some wounded prisoners. I told the fellow that I would conduct him and his squad to my picket post, from where I would send word to our commanding officer, who would take whatever action he deemed proper. On reaching the post, I sent one of the guards back to Carroll Station to report to Lieutenant Armstrong, who was in command of our detachment, that a flag of truce party was at my post requesting an interview with the officer in command at Carroll Station. The lieutenant soon arrived with an armed escort and spoke privately with the Confederate leader. These Confederates were all young men, armed with double-barreled shotguns, and looked like a decidedly tough outfit. Eventually, they left my post, escorted by Lieutenant Armstrong and his guard. From what I understood, Armstrong passed them on to someone higher in authority at another location, possibly at Jackson. They may have been acting in good faith, but judging by their leader's manner and the vague story he told me, I have always believed their use of a flag of truce was mainly a ploy to gather military intelligence. However, I do not know for certain. My responsibility ended when Lieutenant Armstrong reached my picket post in response to my message. We remained at Carroll Station until January 27, 1863, when we were relieved by a detachment of the 62nd Illinois Infantry and sent by rail back to Bolivar, where we rejoined the rest of the regiment. We then resumed our former duty of guarding the railroad north to Toone's Station and continued in this role until the end of May 1863. But before moving on to what happened then, it is appropriate to mention some of the changes that had occurred among the commissioned officers of my company and the regiment. Captain Reddish resigned on April 3, 1863. First Lieutenant Daniel S. Keeley was promoted to captain in his place, and Thomas J. Warren, the sergeant major of the regiment, was commissioned as first lieutenant in Keeley's stead. Lieutenant Colonel Fry resigned on May 14, 1863. His position was filled by Major Simon P. Orr, and Daniel Grass, captain of Company H, was promoted to major. As I have always understood, the resignations of both Fry and Reddish were due to ill health. They were good and brave men, deeply committed to the cause, but they were simply too old to endure the fatigue and hardships of a soldier's life. However, both lived to a good old age. Colonel Fry died in Greene County, Illinois, on January 27, 1881, at nearly 82 years old, and Captain Reddish passed away in Dallas County, Texas, on December 30, 1881, having reached the psalmist's limit of 70. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.